Howdy, my name is Callum, also known as Northern Dice, and today I'm going to be previewing Wombat Combat by Neotroid Games. This is the pre-Kickstarter version, and when this video goes live, it should be live on Kickstarter. Wombat Combat is a 1 to 5 player take that set collection game where players are competing to create armies of wombats up to a certain number based on player count and be the person to earn the most poo cubes based on, well, the wombats they've earned. Despite it being fecally themed, it is nothing to do with its quality. I'm going to get into the preview straight away, but this game blew me away with its high player interaction and its really lovely details. There are a couple of other bits that I want to talk about, but to find out more, let's get into it. So here I've set up Wombat Combat for 3 players. The setup is the same across the board regardless of player count, it just depends on the number of players depending on how many sets of cards you deal. So to kick off, you separate the different effect decks, which are continuous, immediate and endgame. Every player gets 10 poop. Usually you divvy it out into smaller denominations, but just for ease I've stuck to 5, 5, 5, 5 and 10. They do come in ones as well. You get the 3 dice to hand so that they are accessible for when you need them, and every player is dealt 10 cards. After that, you are more or less ready to play, dependent on how you choose start player. You could pick it to something themed around wombats, or something themed around cubes, or something themed around something else. However, first player takes the first turn, and all turns take turns sequentially, going round with the exact same routine be taking place. So let's kick off by just having a quick look at some of the cards that we have got available to us. So the most common ones that you're going to find across all of the cards are wombat cards. And wombat cards have a couple of elements to them. You of course have the wombat in the centre to signify which wombat it is. You also have a poop value, and you have an attack and a defence value. With that, you also have different denominations of these cards, and these link to not only how many of this card there are in the game, but also how much poop they're worth at the end of the game. So an example, this card, there are 14 copies of it, but it is worth 14 poo at the end. Whereas this top card, there are only 6 copies of it in the game, but it is only worth 6 at the end of the game as well. The other thing to take note of with these cards are these, which are vegetables. And these are able to add to your actual value in terms of number of cards, and they give you a little bit more defense. We'll come on to that in a second, but just know that the green cards are incredibly valuable. The flip side to these are the Predator cards, which, exact same format, but instead it has a negative effect against the number of cards available. And finally, we have the effect cards, which are these ones with big blue backs, and they have specific effects that are triggered at specific times. An example of this counter attack: when a predator is played against you, tame that predator, then play back against your opponent. Really linking heavily into that take that theme this game holds so dearly to its heart and its centre. Let's move on to taking a turn. So in Wombat Combat, all players take the exact same routine on their turn, and they take it in clockwise order. And you start out with 10 cards as a standard, and the first thing you do on your turn is draw 3 more cards. So 1, 2, 3. After that, you've got 1 of 3 options. You can either lay wombats into your army. This is how you score points, and it is the endgame condition for winning. So in example, for a 3-player game, you need 5 separate sets of wombats. You can either lay food or a predator onto a army choice of yours or someone else's to be more detrimental if it's a predator. Or you can choose to engage in Wombat Combat. Now, because we have actually got a set that we have just picked up, for the purposes of just this example, we are going to play a little army. So we're going to pick to play 2 of the same wombat. It always has to be the same type of wombat that you play, and you can play any number as long as it's more than 2. The other constraining factor with this is it must be the largest army of that type across the board. So in example, if there was another army of this specific wombat in someone else's, and they had the same or more cards than we did, we could not play these. If we can exceed what they've got, we would play ours, and they would have to put theirs elsewhere to shame, and they would be worth negative points at the end of the game. So we have laid 2 wombats, we have done a cracking job so far with our turn. The final thing that we do is we discard a card. Now we need to be cautious because this is going to be something that someone else will be able to pick up if they wish. So we're going to discard this evade, just for argument's sake. And that is the end of our turn. And then we would move on to the next player. And the game works continuously like this until one player has got 5 sets of wombats out, and at that point, they finish their turn, the game ends, and we move on to final scoring. So we move on to the next player's turn, and they would do the exact same routine. They would look at their 10 cards, establish their options, choose to draw 3 cards. I say choose, they have to draw 3 cards. And oh, what a coincidence, they are drawing the exact wombats we need for the example I want to show. How incredible. So they now have 5 of this wombat, which is awesome, because it means that they definitely exceed the army value of the opponent. Now in some games, not like Wombat Combat, it would be wise to keep some back to be able to stock up. Unfortunately in Wombat Combat, once you've laid an army, you cannot add to it with the same wombat card. The only way you can increase the number you've got is by, let's say you had a 2 down, you'd have to play a 3 and put these wombats to shame. So it makes sense to have the maximum value you can possibly get and lay them all at once. So this player will lay these 5 wombats down, and then they have the greatest army of that type. So these 2 wombats would immediately go into a shame pile for this player, which again are negative points. After that, this player would then choose to discard a card, something they don't believe another player will need, so they will choose to just discard this, and that's the end of their turn. It becomes quite vicious between players in terms of numbers, because we know there are only 12 of that wombat, 5 are there, 2 are now in the shame pile, which means that there are only 5 plus 2 is 7. There are only 5 more available, so you can never exceed it in terms of that. So players will probably want to start getting vicious by playing predators to other wombat armies if they've got 5 as well. Or they might start wanting to look towards these continuous, immediate and endgame effects to try and deter players from attacking, or to encourage players to attack and remove more of those wombats. The other thing to note is the number of wombats in that pile doesn't actually help with endgame scoring. The top number is what you will get in terms of poo value. You will not get 60 because you've got 5. You have got the army of 12, so you would only get 12. And now we'll move on to the third player's turn. And of course, just for flavour, the third player is going to choose to do something that no other player has chosen to do yet. They're going to choose to fight. So we'll run their turn as we should by drawing 3 cards. We go 1, we go 2, we go 3. So they have got lots and lots of just random effects, which is fantastic for them in their combat, but they're going to choose to say, let's go to war. They're going to start fighting. And the way they do that is they work with cards from their hands. Despite the fact you're making armies, you choose cards from your hands, and they choose 3 cards for attacking, so they're going to want much higher value attack if they can get it. They don't necessarily want to be going for lower attack because that's going to be detrimental to them. So let's go for a 2, a 3, and a 3. And they're going to engage in that combat with this player. They've looked at them, they've decided they don't like them, so they're going to start trying to fight them. So they have got 2, 2, 3, so 3, 3, 2, so they are on a value of 8. So that's 8 fighting power in terms of offense that they have got against whatever this player can whip up. And this player is going to choose to play a 3, 2, 1. Because unfortunately for this player, they have got very high attack values, but not very high defense values. So they're on 6. So as it stands, this player is winning. But luckily, the game doesn't just determine victory combat based on card values. You also have these attack and defense die, which have values 1, 2, and 3 equally on them based on whether it's attack or defense. Each player would roll their dice and add the value to their score. Now, just for ease, this is a 2 and a 2, so that makes my life so much easier because that's 3, 3, 2, which is 10, and this is 2, 3, 1, which is 8. So at the moment, this player has lost, this player has won. We could play effect cards onto these. This player has got a lot, but they won't want to because they'll want to save them for another combat. This player actually doesn't have menace, therefore going to want to skip, and the combat would be resolved by one of these wombats would be chosen by the winning player to be shamed and go back into the burrow for negative points. One of these wombats in this combat would be stolen and captured and added to this player's hand. And this one would be sent back to the other player's hand to tell all the other wombats what happened, so they don't mess with that player again. Now the combat is finished, this player can take these cards back into the hand, but before they are able to say, job done, let's move on, they now get to roll the effects die, which has 3 different symbols on it. We have endgame, we have immediate, and we have continuous. They'd roll this die, and we get an immediate effect, and they would then immediately resolve this effect, which says each player must discard down to 9 cards or lose 5 poo. The other thing to note about combat, apologies, completely missed this, the winner also takes 3 poo off of the loser. So we'd get 3 to that one, and this one would get the 2 change. Sorry about that. Other effects include the endgame, which changes the endgame scoring condition for bonus, which says each glorious wombat counts as -1 instead of +3. Again, another effect I forgot to mention, one of the wombats from the victory must become a glorious wombat. They were the leader, they took the charge, which means that they're no longer playable, but they count as positive points until this endgame effect came in. The final thing is the continuous effect, which is something that is constantly in play until replaced. After a combat, all 3 of the loser's wombats go to the bottom of the discard pile. So they no longer become shamed, they no longer get stolen, and they no longer go back to hand. They are immediately lost to the ether of the deck. The game is incredibly intense and high in player interaction because you're not only trying to combat with each other directly, but you're also trying to vie for control in terms of who's got the largest of a type of army to stop other players from playing it, and also ensuring that they cannot add further or you can try to reduce so that you've got an edge. Once one player in this 3-player game gets to 5 armies, separate sets of wombats, the game would end, and players would straight away start counting up how much poo they've got. Poo would be based on tokens gained. It would also be based on the values of the cards that you have got in front of you. Remember, it is only one value. You wouldn't add up all the 12s in this one to make 60. It would just be the 12 because you have got the army of 12 value wombats. After that, whoever's got the most poop, considering endgame scoring conditions as well, and adding in and taking away for glorious and for shamed wombats, whoever's got the most poo would be the winner. Wombat combat is incredibly fast-paced, high-intensity player action fun. There is not a moment where you are not constantly on your toes about who's going to do what, how they're going to do it, and whether you should be cautious. In the same way, when it is your turn to take action and start upsetting other people, there's not a single moment where you're not considering who's the target. Player interaction is actually at the absolute epicenter of this game, and despite the fact that it's so heavily take that censored, it's one of those where you can easily claw something back. No point have I ever thought that because someone's got 4 armies they're guaranteed a win, because players will work together to try and be more detrimental to other players. There are some instances where players of course can have 3 of the number 4 wombat and they can really sort of anchor themselves into that position to control that specific one and guarantee at least one full set for their army. And the game sort of lends itself really heavily to that because then it becomes a more of a risk-reward, what's more valuable, actually having that guarantee of I know that I'm going to get lots of poo cubes for this army, or knowing that because I picked a lower number it's going to be less of a target because it's harder to get hold of the cards, and also because players won't want it because it's going to be less valuable at the end of the game. I have seen players win with the really big wombats because, well, they got very lucky on the draw or they played excellently. In the same way, I've seen players really do well with the low value wombats because nobody could touch them. They had such infrequent appearances that when a player had an army down, it was going to be near impossible to remove it from them. It's a very versatile game, and it's constantly dynamically changing, which is something that I love. These effect cards and this effect dice are the absolute beauty of why you should go into combat. It's not something that's encouraged or forced at any point, and if anything, for some players, when you say it's take that and you know that you can directly confront another player, it's a bit of a back-off moment. But knowing that it is going to change the game on a larger scale in terms of the continuous and endgame effects, it makes it more worthwhile. And the immediate effects can quite often be a bit of a saving grace, particularly if you are in a position where you know someone's out to get you, or you can see someone's really close to getting a set. Having them discard cards, having them lose poo, or having yourself gain things is going to be really helpful, and it makes it worthwhile to really just test the waters with the combat. So it's never an unused mechanic by any player because it's always an option and it's always viable. I've already mentioned how fantastic the player interaction in this game is, and it's worth emphasising it just a second time because of how amazing it is. Players are constantly trying to build these armies, and of course because you can only have one of each type of army in the game at any one time, and there's a set number of cards available, it makes players really interactive. They want to overachieve. They want to get a massive army of that number 12 Wombat because they know that it's going to help concrete their position. In the same way, players are going to want to try and collect those sets in their hands ready to start fighting other players, or more, to be able to lay those armies to outmaneuver so that these 5 immediately become 5 negative points at the end of the game instead of that 12 poo that I could have had. The other reason the player interaction is so superb in this game is because of that combat. You are really pushing your luck when you try and challenge somebody, particularly if your Wombats are more centred around attacking or defending. Once you've shown your hand and you've shown people that you've got heavily attack-oriented Wombats and you've gone and beaten somebody, you immediately become that target because then players know that if they go for you, your defence is going to be shocking. And no matter how lucky the die roll, if you haven't got those effect cards to back you up and they get a very good die roll and their tactics in terms of when they attack you is fantastic, you are going to be, putting it bluntly, screwed. And that makes it exciting, and it also makes it worthwhile to again engage in that combat. The reason I keep coming back to that combat is because when I first tried this game, my biggest worry was that that would be the one unused mechanic within it. Collecting sets is a wonderful thing, and players do love it because it's something that's so ingrained in so many games so easily, with very little risk or reward associated. It's you collect the sets because you collect the sets. As soon as you throw in some take that into a game, though, people back off. They don't want to engage in that confrontation. This game tackles it so beautifully because it's always open hand when you are showing your cards. It's always got an element of randomness to ensure that players have got that scope to have a bit of an edge. And also, it changes that game effect, which makes it worthwhile in the long run. Either because you know that someone's endgame current score is going to be insane based on the card, or because you just want to throw in that extra bit of chaos into the game as well. It works wonderfully to really get players interacting and discussing, which is a major element of any Take That game. And when you can get it to the point where it is done in 30 minutes, and you can then get the game set up and playing again in that amount of time as well, it's a no-brainer in terms of a family game. Now, component quality is a bit of a tricky one to talk about because the copy we have got is pre-production. It is really beautifully illustrated, and I have looked at the Kickstarter preview campaign. The art appears to be consistent across. You've got these wonderful little pictures of Wombats doing lots and lots of different martial arts style, which makes it very thematic and fun. You've got these effect cards, which are very vibrant and easy to see. Some of them have actually got images on, as you've seen in the Evade, which I thought was wonderful. I'd like to see more artwork across those, but that's not a massive thing. It's just one of those that I'd like to see. Yeah, the entire thing really just pops and looks really beautiful. The dice are just plain white dice for me with little stickers on, but the campaign ones actually look like cubes of poo. And I'm in two minds about that. Number one, yeah, amazing, incredible, wow, you really nailed that theme of you are playing with Wombats, so you've got Wombat-themed poo dice. On the other side, it looks like a piece of poo. I've never had a review where I've mentioned poo so much. In fact, I don't think I've ever made a video or talked about poo so much in my life. It's very strange. It's a very odd theme. And I guess that builds into that aesthetic as well. On the table, it looks awesome. It does look like you are just, I don't know, at a blind glance, if you didn't know these were wombats or know anything about the wombat anatomy or ecology, you'd just go, wow, lovely little tokens of wombat food. And you go, ho ho, this is not wombat food. This is the after effects of wombat food. This is after food. I don't know. I like the theme because I think it's fun. I think it's cheerful. I think it's very family friendly and oriented. And I think it's done in a way where no one is going to shy away from it because it is oriented around poo. But at the same time, I do know some people who are a little bit more wary of it, and I think it makes it quite juvenile, which again is why I'm saying so heavily it's an excellent family game. Replayability in the game itself does actually work quite nicely. It's not an overly replayable game. It's one of those where you'll play it, and based on the cards you get, you'll play a game where you are collecting sets. It's not one that necessarily needs lots and lots of big dynamic changes. You get the fantastic dynamic changes from these cards in the combat. You get some wonderful changes based on whether you get lots of event cards, lots of wombat cards. The interaction in terms of how players work always works superbly to really spice things up and make it a different experience every time. But its core mechanic, it stays true to what it is. A set collection, take that game, and you aren't going to have a game where you aren't collecting sets or having a bit of take that. There aren't any ground-breaking or game-breaking effects actually in these cards that are going to really throw spanners in the work. The worst one I've seen is where it makes positives negatives and negatives positives, and that's just something that you work with, or you can either see as a blessing or a curse based on your current circumstance. With that as well, I do feel like the actual wombat numbers, once you know which wombats are which and you sort of get a feel for their combat values, you could sort of have somewhat of an edge and know which wombats to lay and which ones to keep, but it's not like it's a big learning curve. You look at the card, you see that the 16 wombats got 2 attack and 3 defense, so if you are not wanting to go into combat too much, if you get challenged, that'd be a good one to keep in your hand for that defensive matter. In the same way, if you are wanting to go gung-ho and constantly be playing fisticuffs, the Luchador wombat with its 4 attack and 1 defense would be fantastic to have. In fact, if you've got a set of 3 in your hand, there are 14 of these cards in the game, could be worth just sacrificing having an army so that you're able to continually go into combat, remembering that one of these would go into your glorious wombats every time, and if you played that quite nicely with an endgame effect, you could really start upsetting people and getting yourself some big scores. But again, that's more really in-depth tactics with a long endgame strategy, and it doesn't account for all the chaos. I personally think the replayability of this game is exactly where it should be. You'll always have the exact same mechanics in play, but you'll have a different experience based on the player interaction and what's being dealt. Nothing groundbreaking, nothing game-breaking, just a pure, good fun family game. There's no prizes for guessing where I think this game sits in terms of a collection. I'd recommend this, and I'd heavily recommend it to family gamers. I keep on mentioning that it's for families, and that's because I can happily see this being played with families. That lovely element of just being able to enjoy a quick take that set collection game where you can see the tension ramping up as people start playing cards. The game ends immediately, so there's no panic in that last second. There's no scope for analysis paralysis. You could get those big boy tactics in, as I've said, but realistically, it's just going to slow a very fast-paced game down unnecessarily. I'm not saying it's one that you need to play without thinking and considering, but it is one that you do need some element of pace and prowess to know how to quickly deal with situations in an ever-changing dynamic on the table. I do think that it is quite acceptable to say gamers would enjoy this if you're quite a hobby gamer. As always, if you are someone who's looking for something with big boy miniatures, non-stop tactics and 14 weeks of planning before you engage in the combat, then this isn't for you, because this is, again, paced, very quick, very snappy, very fun. I'm not saying that war games aren't fun, but you catch my drift. It sits much better with families because it has got that very quick turnaround in terms of game finishing and the very quick reset up and teach. Me and my friends, when we play it, we do enjoy it. We don't play as family gamers, we play as incredibly competitive gamers against each other, wanting to vie for that victory. And we enjoy it, and it is something that we will come back to, no doubt. But I think this would be better in a family gamers collection because the theme, the artwork, the mechanics, and the fact that, again, it's a very pacey game, all fit really nicely into that. If I were to play this on a regular basis, it'd be my warm-up game. If families were to play this, this might be the main game of the night they play several times and have an absolute blast with it. Do I have any gripes with this game? In all honesty, no, I don't. My biggest concern was the fact that combat might not be used, but I have eaten humble pie and recognised that that is quite an integral element of the game because of these cards and because of how interactive it becomes. My other concern was the theme, and when I try and approach my friends and say, do you want to play a game about wombats fighting over cubes of poo, it'd be shunned or laughed out, but again, because it is so playful and jovial with its theme, its artwork and its aesthetic, it sort of fits into that lovely element of you are fighting over cubes of poo. It's also a little bit educational, I guess, but I mean, I don't know how much it's going to help you to know that wombats poo cubes. Anyway, I've gone completely off topic with that little statement. I don't really have any concerns with this game. I think it's a really lovely game that works really well with what it does. It engages players in player interaction, engages players fantastically in take that, and it makes sure that everybody is always focused on that set collection. If you sit there at the table and just try and attack people, you're going to have a bad game, and that's not because of how the game is set up, that's because of how you're engaging with the game. You are just wanting to focus on the mechanics. And I guess If anything, one gripe I'd say is it's a one-trick pony. You do what you do. But in all honesty, because I think this is more of a family game, I'd say that's an absolute top-tier benefit. And if anything, one of the massive big pros that this game holds. You are doing what you are meant to do every single time, or you are going to lose. I think, yeah, it's a really lovely game that I've really enjoyed previewing. So this was Wombat Combat. It's currently on Kickstarter. I would recommend checking it out just to see all the reviews and get other opinions as well on top of my own if you have listened this far. I've really enjoyed engaging with this game and previewing it. I'm really excited to see that final product's fully done. I think the artwork is an absolute stunner. The interaction works so beautifully. The mechanics, the consistency of each game to game of what you're doing, being so ingrained in what you need to do, really benefit this game massively. Again, family game in my opinion, but other people may have other experiences, and I do encourage you to check out other reviews and consider what other reviewers have thought of this game as well. But from what I've seen, it has been incredibly well received by anybody I've spoken to, and rightfully so in my opinion, because I think this is an absolute little gem. As always, thank you ever so much for sticking around for this long to check out my ramblings of this preview of Wombat Combat by Neotroy Games. I will catch you next time.